We all love an anti-hero. Suave, witty, eloquent, handsome, intelligent, with a loose moral code and just the right amount of arrogance, we can't get enough. We eat anti-heroes up by the bowlful, and I'm really interested in exploring why. Take Reynard the Fox. Reynard is, for those of you unfamiliar with his 875-year-long hold over the landscape of European folklore, a very bad fox. He lies, steals, tricks, and murders. He feigns a show of remorse only to repeat and re-repeat his many offences, and his ultimate motivation, it would seem, is to serve himself. He is a devious, cunning, bloodthirsty trickster, but he's also beloved. Reynard the Fox has enthralled and enchanted readers for 875 long years. For better or for worse, he is an icon of folklore and has been the inspiration for other beloved anti-heroes over the centuries, many of whom I'm sure you'll recognise. But why? Reynard does some very shit things and he's very self-serving, so why do we let him get away with it? Why do we always forgive the anti-hero? But before we attempt to answer that question, hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe, this is Mousy Mouse Mouse, and we make videos on all kinds of writing and reading, so please do subscribe if that is, indeed, your jam. Thank you, as always, to our patrons over on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube. We really appreciate your generosity and your support, and if you'd like to join them, there's a link down below. Now, Reynard's antics and those of his peers are rather grim, so please beware going forward. This video contains discussions of domestic abuse, rape, mutilation, and murder, and I will be giving a second content warning later on, just ahead of some of the particularly grisly stuff. With all that said and done, let us begin by journeying back through those aforementioned 875 years to explore the history of Reynard the Fox and find out how he came to be literature's greatest lovable murderer. The exploits and close shaves of Reynard the Fox are the subject of a literary cycle of medieval folk stories that take place in the court of King Noble the Lion. An extensive cast of non-human animal characters, each with their own distinctive traits, make up the court of King Noble, who is himself glory-hungry, treasure-obsessed, and short-sighted. So, as well as greedy King Noble and suave, cunning Reynard, we've got characters like Reynard's loathsome arch-enemy, Isengrim the Wolf, wise and compassionate Grimbart the Badger, greedy and foolish Bruin the Bear, lofty and snobbish Tybert the Cat, and the list goes on. Humans do appear in the cycle too, but they're often on the fringes of the tale. These are the heraldries of beasts. Beasts like the ones you see here in these tapestries behind me. Can you spot the fox, by the way? It might be a bit of a challenge because these animals are all designed in that kind of strange, mythical, non-realistic, medieval style. There he is. I really like this kind of design, but you might not. You might be like, nah, I want to draw a realistic, true-to-life fox for my tapestry, and now you can, with help from today's sponsor, Craftsy. Craftsy is your one-stop shop for creative resources. They've got over 2,000 different classes, as well as projects and recipes for you to really get your teeth stuck into, from drawing wild animals with Charlena Wood to crocheting accessories with Valeria Torres. I chose to take a class called Acrylic Colour Mixing Made Easy with Carol McIntyre, which was a really helpful starting point for me as a complete painting novice. I haven't used any kind of paint, I don't think, since I was probably in primary school. I have this vision of filling my house with teeny, gothic-themed polymer clay miniatures, like little skulls or tiny cursed books and that kind of thing. So I recently bought some clay and the necessary tools, and I bought some acrylic paint, which I now know how to mix effectively to get the creepiest tones for my weird little creations, all thanks to Craftsy. McIntyre even has a lesson specifically dedicated to mixing different shades of green, so now I can get the perfect shade for a bubbling cauldron or a spooky swamp creature. Craftsy has plenty of other painting classes that I plan to check out too, like Acrylic Painting 101 with Courtney Pilgrim, or Acrylic Painting Basics and Beyond with Michael Lim. So I've got a lot to keep me going, and so can you when you join the Craftsy community. They're always adding new classes taught by friendly and knowledgeable experts to help you develop your skills. Plus, you'll be joining a community of like-minded DIY enthusiasts. If you're interested, you can go to the link down below and get the first full year of Craftsy Premium for only $1.49. Offer valid for new members only. Thank you to Craftsy for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the fox. The earliest recorded mention of Reynard dates back to approximately the year 1149 and can be found in the Latin poem Isengrimus, named after the poem's titular character and Reynard's key adversary, Isengrim the Wolf. Reynard then passed through the hands of numerous writers. Notable names like Chaucer, Goethe, and Jacob Grimm all took their turn with the fox. Throughout the centuries, Reynard flourished, and his cycle of stories spread rapidly throughout Dutch, English, French and German folklore. So popular was he among French audiences that renard became the default word for fox in French. And really, we can trace Reynard's origins back even further than 1149. The archetype of the trickster fox has always been a favourite. Going back over 2,500 years to the time of Aesop, we find the devious fox causing trouble in the fables. Now, of course, fast forward through the centuries and you'll find that differing fates befall the fox and his fellows. Sometimes Reynard is captured and executed by an incensed king. Sometimes, and really more often than not, he manages to wriggle free from the clutches of court and continues his tirade of lying and plundering. But whatever the weather, Reynard the Fox persists in literature and art. There's something compelling, alluring, perhaps endearing, about a roguish character who repeatedly challenges authority, who won't obey the rule of an arrogant king, conform to the hierarchy of court, or pander to the whims of the nobility. Reynard is often depicted as an outsider looking in, gifted with the ability to properly observe, critique, and maybe even dismantle the systems of power in which he finds himself. But how does he actually do this? Where can we read a really fantastic adaptation of Reynard that can give us all the answers we seek, that shows us why we always forgive an anti-hero like the fox? Right here! We can read it right here in this wonderful 2021 edition of Reynard the Fox by Anne Louise Avery. It's a very accessible version of the tale. It's not a dense Latin mock epic poem, I'm sure you'll be thrilled to learn, and it's beautifully written. In fact, when I picked up this book, it had nothing to do with Reynard and everything to do with the fact I love Avery's writing. Her prose is frickin' delicious. Let me give you an example. As they, that's the animals at court, argued and vacillated over the best course to take in the thorny matter of Reynard, a sleepy dusk fell over the castle, and the stars brightened in the clear sky. Swallows and martinets darted in and out of rough nests woven into the eaves and arches and castellations, and little bats flickered over the moat in the half-light. On and on they talked, as the constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear, wheeled slowly over the countryside, over the long rows of pollarded willows and the windmills and the reedy marshland edging the German Sea, and, miles to the east, over a tranquil Malperdue where Reynard and his wife Hermeline were lying on top of a tower, drinking Portuguese wine and suckling on brightly coloured marchpane. If you watch a lot of this channel, it won't come as a surprise to you that I love this. It's just so rich and unusual and lyrical. So, when this book arrived and I started reading, I wasn't surprised that the prose was magic. I knew it would be. I was, however, very surprised by the story I was reading, by the excessive roguishness and cruelty and violence of Reynard the Fox. So, the story begins with Reynard failing to attend a summons to court. In his absence, lots of his fellow creatures, spurred on by the vile Isengrim the wolf, air their complaints about Reynard to King Noble the lion. And these are no small complaints. Worst of all is the testimony of Chanticleer the cockerel, who arrives at court one night, all in black, followed by a bier bearing the mortal remains of a little hen, head quite removed from her body, brutally murdered by Reynard the Fox. We learn that these are the remains of Chanticleer's best beloved daughter, Coppen, a sweet young hen on the cusp of life in all its joys and sorrows. And we learn that this wasn't the first of Chanticleer's children to fall to the fox. Crazed and cunning, he stole baby after baby. He slaughtered my family. He killed them chick after chick after chick. My darlings. He killed 15 of my darlings as though they were nothing, was nothing at all. Now, as this story is set up with Reynard as the protagonist, you might want to believe that he is being falsely set up here. Maybe Isengrim killed Coppen and Chanticleer's other 14 children and is trying to pin the blame on Reynard. But unfortunately, Reynard is, indeed, guilty. So, Noble sends one of his top emissaries, Bruin the Bear, to make the day's journey to Malperdue, Reynard's castle hidden deep in the forest, and fetch him to answer for his crimes. Bruin, however, is very greedy and not very bright, and Reynard knows this. He sees the bear coming, uses his greed against him, and long story short, Bruin ends up getting stuck in a log where he is brutally attacked by a village of humans whose tendency towards violence the fox also exploits. The terrified bear realised it would be far better to lose his muzzle than fall into their clutches. He wrestled and strained and pulled so hard that he managed to pluck his head out of the log, but unfortunately left most of his fur and both of his ears behind. Poor old Bruin, blood running over his eyes so he could barely see. He looked like a monster or a red devil from a chapel painting. No one had ever seen a fouler or more loathsome beast. Reynard leaves Bruin for dead, but the bear manages to escape, returning to court bloodied and beaten, which infuriates King Noble, and he promptly sends another emissary to finish the job. This time, it's the turn of Tybert the cat, who isn't strong like Bruin the bear, but has decades of book learning up his sleeve, which Noble believes will certainly lead to Reynard's arrest. But Tybert, full of intellectual vanity and pomposity but little original thought, is also tricked by Reynard, who plays on the cat's greed and leaves him at the mercy of more violent humans. And, like Bruin, poor Tybert comes out of it all mangled and ruined, in a state of terrible jeopardy and dread. Body limp with brattle blows, blinded in one eye, his beautiful grey fur caked in blood and dung and mud. Tybert returns to court, and yet another emissary is sent to deal with the fox, but this time it's his friend, Grimbart the badger, who doesn't approve of Reynard's violence and cruelty, but loves him and loves his family, his brilliant and studious wife Hermeline, and their 3 children, Reynardine, Rainkin and Rossel, and Grimbart actually manages to convince Reynard to come back with him to court. What follows is a magnificent, single-handed defence delivered to king and court by Reynard, who manages to turn the fury of his peers into awe and respect, all the while dancing dangerously close to the gallows. He enters the court with all the audacity of a true anti-hero, his cape swirling around him like Robin Hood the Outlaw or Fair Lancelot. He swaggered and sauntered through the streets, dagger flashing, brush waving high, winking at the ladies and exchanging sparkling conceits with the sober burghers of Ghent, until he had thoroughly bewitched the crowds, who had begun to whisper that those snobby grandlings up at the castle had got it all wrong. How could such a witty and unpretentious fox be a murderer or a thief? And not only does Reynard walk the walk, but he most certainly talks the talk as well. He tells such a story and gives such a performance that he soon has the entire court in the palm of his paw, so much so that Avery even includes what feels like an aside to the reader, almost as if to remind us not to get sucked in with them. Listen below the words. Listen through them. Listen around them. Listen behind them. Listen to Sir Reynard the Fox on that moonlit night, as he performs one of the greatest acts of deception and swikedom fair Flanders has ever seen. Listen to the skill with which he flatters the king and the queen. Listen as he wins both their goodwill and their love. Listen to how he hinders those who labour for his death. Listen as the fox slowly and deftly unbinds his whole pack of tricks, his flattery and fine words, his warm and sugary russet charm, his bold-faced blandishments. He has brought forth a spool of raw lies and spun them into a glittering web of truth to trap them all. Every last one of them. This whole section really reminds me of Antony's speech in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Reynard is the genius orator, using his wiles and his rhetoric to entirely bewitch and manipulate the braying mob. With the utmost confidence, he comes to court and gives the performance of a lifetime, weaving his own version of reality, playing on the people's love for nostalgia and chivalry as he bows a magnificent bow, a bow of old romances and high, fluttering flags and half-forgotten curtsies, before addressing the crowd in his most silken voice. He grossly and successfully flatters the king and queen, feigns his religious devotion, his willingness to change, his enlightened piety. But what really seals the deal and turns the court from a braying mob hungry to see him swing into his most devoted, his most passionate fans, is his promise of treasure, a gargantuan, unimaginable hoard of treasure, the location of which only he knows and only he can retrieve, and which he promises to deliver to the king, the delicious description of which you can hear me read over on Patreon. So Noble completely falls for this, and he sends Reynard on his way to bring back the eminent stash of gold and gems. But of course, there is no treasure. This is all a lie, and literally, instead of going to fetch the treasure, the promise of which saved his neck, he takes 2 courtiers back to his castle, murders one of them, the poor, trusting, nervous Coat the Hare, who believes that Reynard is his friend, and effectively sets up the other, Bellin the Ram, to take the fall for his crimes. When Noble finds this out, he's fully raging. He summons Reynard back, and again, Reynard returns to the court under the persuasion of Grimbart the Badger. Reynard faces a tougher battle this time. Noble is incensed. Isengrim is going in for the kill. Numerous courtiers have had enough of Reynard's constant lying. But Reynard still has his friends at court. He's defended at length by the astute Dame Rukenor the Ape, amongst others, and rallies to make a final plea for his life. He soon has the court in the palm of his paw again, and wins King Noble over again, but Isengrim cannot be foxed. He challenges Reynard to a fight to the death, which Noble and his courtiers are buzzed for. They love a good gladiatorial fisticuffs. It's a dicey affair, but Reynard eventually wins the fight. Noble stops the battle before Isengrim is killed to spare him, and Reynard is pardoned and celebrated, and all is well. The end. But something doesn't quite feel right, does it? Based on this quick whip round of events, Reynard feels more like a villain than a lovable, roguish anti-hero. He did, we know, commit most of the crimes he is accused of committing. He murdered Coppin and her siblings. He murdered and ate Coat the Hare. He tricked Bruin and Tybert, amongst many others, mind, into situations that led to their being brutally mutilated. He lied, repeatedly, to pretty much everyone. He repented for his crimes, and repeated them. How is it okay that the story ends with him essentially winning the day and getting off scot-free? Is Reynard really an anti-hero? And do we really forgive him? Now, I've got to say, there is a big part of me that feels pretty uneasy with all of this. Reynard does some extremely grim things, but throughout the narrative, I also feel for him. I don't want him to lose the fight with Isengrim. I am, in spite of everything, on his side, I think, at the end of the story. And here are the reasons why. Number one, he's flawed, but not too flawed. Reynard, as I hope to have demonstrated, does some very villainous stuff. But he is not the story's villain. He's pretty bad, but nowhere nearly as bad as his main adversary, the despicable Isengrim the Wolf. You see, Reynard, for all his flaws, has a range of redeeming qualities, which we'll get to shortly, but Isengrim has literally none. He is an exceedingly loathsome critter, and Avery makes sure that we understand this about him without him having to do or say anything. Take one look at him, and you know he's evil. Isengrim was tall and rangy and covered in jagged, ragged scars from his many duels and skirmishes. He wore a broad, scallop-edged cloak trimmed in dark beaver fur, which swirled around him like a dirty grey rain cloud, soiled black velvet breeches, and high black leather boots laced at the side. Around his neck, a dirty scarlet kerchief. Around his waist, a wide leather belt, also crow-black, hung with various sinister items. When he passes by, he leaves behind his sour scent of privies and raw meat and decayed teeth. Ew, right? Now, compare Isengrim's outward appearance to Reynard's. Reynard moved closely and spoke very softly. Unlike Isengrim's foul stench, his fur smelt of fresh fallen acorns and rich peat, of sweet mint and wild betony, of the damp forest floor and the high, rare cold of stone towers. This is truly one of my favourite pieces of description ever. It's delectable, but also for our purposes, it shows us just how different these two characters are. Now, you might be thinking, don't judge a book by its cover. Isengrim might look and smell disgusting, but what about who he is in here? But Isengrim is actually also disgusting inside and outside, and Avery gives us many examples of this. At every opportunity in the narrative, the wolf is hateful, vengeful, power-hungry, blood-hungry, and ruthless. He is as nasty and brutal and frightening as they come. He had no compassion, no love, no kindness. He prayed only for himself and his own soul. He kicked his children, bullied his servants, and beat and belittled and betrayed his wife. The only lord in Flanders who had the nerve and the wit to stand up to him was Reynard the Fox. So not only does Reynard challenge the wolf in his cruelty, but he, by comparison, has a good relationship with his wife and children. His 3 cubs loved their father and thought he was the best father in Flanders. He never beat them, low bar, but okay, or shouted at them, and he played with them whenever he could. He taught them hunting and all about the stars and the weather. By contrast, Isengrim behaves in a vile manner towards his family. Worst of all, and which Avery brings out with such care and intention, is the way he treats his wife, Urswind. She is the main victim of his foul, vengeful outpourings. There's a passage where Isengrim is addressing the court, and people are laughing at him in a mocking way, and he doesn't really expect this, and Erswyn knows she will be the one to pay for her husband's embarrassment. She crouched down and sorrowed quietly to herself, knowing exactly who would bear the brunt of their easy mirth. Isengrim cheats on Erswyn, is physically abusive to her. Reynard sees him at court quietly nipping Erswyn's back leg hard, and throughout the narrative he uses her to further his own ends, never letting her speak for herself. Erswyn lifted her head and pulled herself up, and stood swavering, as though she was about to faint clean away. Her gown was grey and tatty, and she looked a little like the ghostie that was said to haunt the castle wine cellars round Christmastide. She took a deep breath and was about to speak when Isengrim snarled and jumped down. "I know what my wife was going to say, and I shall have the saying of it." And in this casual way, Isengrim stole Erswyn's voice once more, thieved it without a second thought, without a pang of conscience, as so many have done before, and so many will do after. In the introduction to her edition, Avery mentions that she deliberately fleshes out Erswyn's role in the narrative, giving her a more powerful and more self-determined trajectory, and I think she does such a great job of this. Erswyn is, in my opinion, one of the few characters in this story who is completely endearing, who suffers through no fault of her own. She's very much on the fringes of the narrative, but the way she's treated, and the way her suffering is largely ignored by the court, gives the story real weight. And, by the end, shows up a fundamental difference between Reynard and Isengrim, between anti-hero and out-and-out villain. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, essentially, Reynard is cruel and deceitful, but, unlike Isengrim, that's not all he is. And by being flawed but not too flawed, he is relatable. This is one of the reasons we love an anti-hero, because they make mistakes, just like us. Heroes are too high and mighty, drawn with too much idealism. Their levels of goodness are unattainable, and their constant self-sacrificing goody-goody antics make us feel bad about ourselves and all the stupid decisions we make. A character like Reynard isn't a perfect, valiant hero, but he's not an evil Isengrim. He's flawed, but not too flawed, just like us. Number 2, he shows vulnerability. There are plenty of points in this book that I found myself getting really, really angry at Reynard. The bald-faced lies, the barbarous tricks he pulls, and the traps he sets. I'm often at the cusp of tossing the book aside, and then he shows us his vulnerable side. His actual, real vulnerable side, mind you, not to be confused with the many instances during his long, eloquent speeches where he pretends to show vulnerability, like in this passage. So here, he's just been pardoned by Noble, and he's heading out on his pilgrimage to bring the greedy king his treasure. Reynard trod slowly towards the king, tears dripping down his black whiskers, flowing down his long, torn, russet face, a model of piety, stung with the regret of departing from a beloved liege lord. Oh, Reynard played the part well, as though his heart was cleaving in two from his grief. But, really, his own true sorrow at that precise moment was simply that he hadn't managed to cause as much trouble for the other animals at court. But then we get these brief yet oh so impactful glimpses into the real Reynard. So at one point in his grand performance, Reynard recounts his father's dealings with Bruin the bear. And he's got the court in the palm of his paw, he's making them laugh, making a show of Bruin here. But while they're all laughing, Reynard didn't even smile. And there was a look in his eyes. A look which transcended the tale. A look of pain which had nothing to do with his fabrications, but led back many, many years to a sudden bark and a scream one winter night, when the berries were scarlet against the snow, and he lost all that was once safe and dear to him. It's in moments like these, moments where we're given privileged access to the real Reynard, the Reynard who has suffered, who thinks back to his father and his youth and a memory that haunts him, and crucially takes him out of the performance he's spinning, that our understanding of him, and maybe even our affection for him, is seeded. Yes, he's in the middle of a cascade of lies designed to dazzle the court into forgetting the fact that he's a mass murderer, but there's also something very human about him here. And we get other passages like this, where he shows true fear for his life or for the safety of his family. This stuff isn't part of the performance. It's real fear, real sorrow, and real guilt. We start to get the impression that maybe some of his pandering to the court, the performances he enacts to wriggle free of the hangman's grasp, have roots in truth. By showing us his vulnerabilities, he becomes even more relatable, and perhaps he even starts to win our sympathy. Number 3, he holds up a mirror to the hypocrisy of court. This is a really important point, and one Avery's narrative really brings to the fore. As this article puts it, Reynard is an anti-hero, saved only by the fact that everyone else sucks too. When it comes to the charges against him, Reynard isn't alone in committing his crimes. He isn't actually doing anything that King Noble, Queen Ghent, and pretty much everyone at court isn't also doing, to some extent at least. So Reynard is wanted for killing and eating other animals, right? But all the way through the narrative, King Noble, Tybert the cat, Bruin the bear, Isengrim, they're all eating other animals, and seemingly doing so without consequence. Bruin's light morning repast includes such delicacies as roast capons, crispy and succulent, fatty veal pies, rich morsels of roast swan, and so on and so on. Tybert is ravenously addicted to mice, and King Noble basically eats whatever or whomever he wants, and we repeatedly find him gorging himself throughout the narrative. Now, maybe these capons and swans and mice aren't part of the court, I don't know, it's never really explained, but the fact remains that Reynard is being punished for doing something that, it would seem, almost everyone else at court is also doing. So when he then goes on to trick them, deceive them, and manipulate them, Reynard is, in a sense, turning the tables on them, essentially challenging the notion that he should be punished and they shouldn't be. Using his tricks and wiles, Reynard exposes the hypocrisy of his peers. And, as Joan Acachella writes, we, as readers, like to see intelligence triumph over power. Its brains over brawn, its smarts winning out over King Noble's foolishness and greed. And as well as showing up the hypocrisy of his peers, Reynard highlights their other flaws too. Bruin the bear, for instance, is gluttonous and greedy. When he sets off on his quest to bring Reynard back to court, he has every intention of apprehending the fox, and yet, when Reynard tells him about a secret stash of honey, his favourite food, Bruin immediately caves. "Oh, for just one lick," he pleads, "I shall become the most faithful of your kindred. I shall protect you at court, fight your corner with King Noble and your accusers, put your neck before mine. I entreat you, Sir Fox, take pity on me, and let me have a mere smatch, a mere scraping of that nice, fresh honey." And, as we're all aware, this does not end well for the bear. Reynard, throughout the story, is exposing the greed, the arrogance, the hypocrisy, the pandering, the lack of personal responsibility that he sees in the majority of animals at court. That he can so easily turn a braying mob hell-bent on letting him swing into his personal cheer squad demonstrates that these characters, who are so easily duped and so lacking in the ability to think for themselves, maybe shouldn't really be in positions of power and influence. Reynard shows up the inherent problem with life at court, and with the power structures that create hierarchy. As Avery puts it, entirely through his wiles and his ability to spin a compelling tale out of nothing, the establishment is mocked and bettered again and again. Hierarchies are upended, and the rich and foolish and overprivileged are exposed and thoroughly punished for their sins. Looking at him through this lens, Reynard becomes a renegade. Not perfect, very, very flawed, but at least he thinks for himself. At least he's trying to shake things up instead of pandering to the greedy, foolish, and inept king who, as Avery tells us, would sink into a mental torpor when prevailed upon to rule rather than simply luxuriate in the pomp and riches of his rank. Reynard embodies a free-spirited, revolutionary sentiment that seeks to upturn existing power structures that benefit the few. Number 4. He redeems himself, and crucially, does this in his own way, and not in the way that society expects of him. The main reason, I would say, that we forgive the anti-hero is because they often do something big to redeem themselves. Something kind, maybe selfless, something that shows how they've grown from self-serving to at least a little bit concerned for the well-being of others. Let's return to Ercwind here, whose story arc in Avery's edition is a good example of Reynard's redemption, if you choose to see it that way. So a bit of background regarding Reynard and Ercwind. They have a bit of history. The two of them apparently had a bit of a thing before she married Isengrim and he married his wife Hermeline, and Reynard also kissed her once after, something he is very guilty about. "I am sorrier for this sinning than for all the other wrongdoings put together. I have shamed her, a good, kind wolf, so unlike her husband. Oh, my dearest wife. I kissed her last Baptist day in her still room when she was making her famous rose sugar. Isengrim, as you might imagine, is very jealous and angry about this, and in his final tirade against the fox, Isengrim accuses Reynard of raping Urswind. Now, I want to dwell on this for a minute, but before I do, I just want to say that this section of the video is upsetting, and the passage of the story I'm going to analyse contains some very gruesome imagery, so if that's going to be too much for you, please skip to the time on screen here. Basically, what you need to know is that Reynard mistreats Urswind, but by the end of the story, he's trying to put this right. So, in Avery's version of the story, it is suggested that Isengrim's accusation that Reynard raped Urswind is unfounded. It seems as though Isengrim is essentially making it up. Reynard denies the accusation, and he asks Urswind to corroborate this, but Isengrim silences her, which seems to imply that the wolf is forbidding his wife from telling the truth. It's important to point out, though, that we don't actually know for sure. We don't find out what happened. But the way Avery frames it suggests, to me at least, that it's Isengrim who is lying here. But this isn't the case in all editions of the story. In some editions, Reynard does rape Urswind. It's Reynard's perpetration of crimes like this that prompt Joan Acocella to challenge the very idea that Reynard is even an anti-hero, and draw our attention instead to the extent of his moral ugliness and the way he indulges in ecstasies of cruelty. If Avery had kept an explicit rape in her version, it would have massively changed the tenor of the entire thing, but she chooses not to. That's not to say, however, that Urswind doesn't suffer at Reynard's paws in Avery's version. So, just before Reynard is about to set off from court to bring the king his non-existent treasure hoard, Reynard, who is flying pretty high, having just deceived everyone, decides he wants to go one further and wreak revenge on the courtiers who accused him. He has Bruin partially flayed in order to use his fur as a bag, and he has Isengrim's paw pads cut off to make a sturdy pair of shoes for the road. Now, this is grim enough. But what's far worse and far more stomach-churning is that, for some reason, he also asks for the paw pads of Isengrim's long-suffering wife, Urswind. It's not actually completely clear to me why he does this. My best guess is that he's just on a bit of a high and just wants to cause as much pain and havoc to the court in general as he can in an act of revenge. He takes Urswind's paw pads. He's not unaware of the pain he's caused her. We get a sense of his regret, but he still does it. This section of the story is very much Reynard indulging in the ecstasies of cruelty. It's really hard to see past this point in the book, actually. It's vile, and truly it makes my heart break for Urswind. She gets the worst of everything and everyone. It's also interesting to note that in earlier iterations of the story, Urswind is apparently portrayed as a lustful, loose female character. And if there's one type of character who has historically been horrendously depicted and treated and punished in art and literature, it's the lustful, loose female character. Avery's Urswind is not characterised in this way, but she still gets the shit end of literally everything and everyone. But by the end of the story, this is something Reynard attempts to put right. Now, every time King Noble decides to let Reynard off the hook, it always comes with the caveat that he must, from hence, be an upstanding citizen. No more murdering hens, no more lying, no more ignoring summons to court. Outwardly, Reynard promises that of course he has turned a new leaf, he will vow to never again disobey the king, but he's lying, of course. Noble might not know it, but we sure do. So he doesn't redeem himself in the way his king commands, but that's not to say that he is without redemption. Reynard, you might argue, or you might not, you might feel that his horrendous actions put him beyond the pale, tries to redeem himself by helping Urswind out of her miserable marriage. After the big climactic fight between fox and wolf, Urswind, sick of being abused, mutilated, mistreated, threatened, and miserable, decides to leave court in the dead of night. She readied her cubs, who were finally old enough and strong enough to travel, and packed her small collection of jewellery, her psalter, her herbs, some toys, and a letter of introduction written by Queen Ghent, Noble's wife, to her remaining brother in Toulouse, asking him to protect and shelter the Lady Wolf for as long as she required. Finally, sewn into her travelling cloak was a little silk pouch of gems, including a curious gold ring inscribed in an old Hebrew script, slipped to her by Reynard the Fox just before the battle, his sleight of paw unnoticed by the rest of the court. Running as hard as she could, with her bad leg and aching feet, the cubs barking encouragement all the way, Urswind reached Mons at daybreak. By the end of the following week, travelling steadily by night and sleeping during the day, she reached Aquitaine and safety. Now, you might be sat there thinking, okay, Great. But does that really redeem the fox for all his sins and the specific cruelty that he's enacted upon Erskine herself? And I don't know. In many ways, I don't think so. But it is worth noting that this is one of the very few selfless acts Reynard performs during the narrative. It's also significant to note that when he does attempt to redeem himself, it's not by towing the line and becoming a courtly hypocrite. He provides essential assistance to the one character in the story who needs it most, the one character who actually really deserves a happy ending. And though we don't know the extent of her grievances towards Reynard, we do know that Erskine is grateful to the fox. She and her children were never seen in Ghent again. But once a year, Reynard would receive a letter, faintly scented with mimosa and orange blossom, carried to Flanders from the far south by the swallows, and with only ever one word written inside, in Occitan: Mercés. Thank you. So, why do we always forgive the anti-hero? And I want to preface this with maybe we don't, or maybe we shouldn't. I think it very much depends on the anti-hero themselves, and it's also worth pointing out that an anti-hero to one person may well be an outright villain to another. But to speak in general terms, it's because we see at least a little bit of ourselves in them. We relate, on some level, to their flaws, their vulnerabilities, and the way they grow and develop. When they're truly up against the wall, they will usually end up doing the right thing, whatever that may be, and they will often be brave enough to do it in their own way. They pose a challenge to established law and order, often revealing the corruption therein. They also typically embody enviable traits: bravery, eloquence, intelligence, and the knack for getting out of a scrape just in the nick of time. The anti-hero has all the wiles and cunning of the villain, and, hopefully, tucked deep down, at least a sliver of the true-fast moral compass of the hero. They're everything we wish we were, and everything we take pains to hide. Above all, and not to sound too twee here, they are true to themselves, to their nature. They are a refreshing antidote to characters who self-betray or blithely follow the rules. Now, I'm not saying that this should give them a get-out-of-jail-free card by any means, but I am suggesting that the anti-hero is, for the most part, unapologetically themselves. And it's ultimately this quality, I think, that makes it so that we can overlook some of their more treacherous deeds. Reynard is out here essentially saying, hey, he who cast the first stone, forcing his audience to examine their own consciences, their own dirty deeds. And with a doff of his cap and a flick of his tail, he's dancing all the way back down Gallows Hill. I hope you enjoyed this grisly foray into the anti-heroics of Reynard the Fox, and I would love to hear what you think. Would you forgive Reynard? Does he deserve the king's pardon? Or should he swing for his crimes? Is he even an anti-hero, or do you think he's an out-and-out villain? Do let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about the long literary history of public figures distracting from their misdeeds in tricksy speeches, watch my video on how Shakespeare impacts contemporary politics and MAGA populism by clicking here next.